Hello, my name is Olorotimi Osha. Today is July the 27th, 2026. I'm continuing with my discussion on Homer's The Odyssey and comparing it with Christopher Nolan's blockbuster, which is raked in almost $700 million, right? And of course, far exceeded its $250 million budget. I guess the founding fathers would be tickled that everybody's discussing the classics because of the release of Nolan's The Odyssey, right? Of course, the Christopher Nolan has reimagined his Odyssey and made it sort of like uh, a Greek. Uh, he's created a John Rambo veteran's PTSD story using Homer's 3,000-year-old characters. But that's not what I want to discuss today. Right now, I want to discuss book 23, which Christopher Nolan left out. And I think book 23 is very important because it provides an archetype of a feminist homogamous relationship, a homogamous marriage. And I'll describe what these things are. For those of us who don't know, a homogamous relationship or homogamy is uh, like a relationship or marriage of equals, right? That's the husband and the wife when they're equals. It could be age homogamy. That's where people, the husband and wife are, about the same age, right? Or social homogamy, they belong to the same social class. Or educational homogamy, they are equal in terms of educational attainment, right? So social status, so that's what homogamy is, the equality, more egalitarian equality of the relationship between husband and wife. This is important because in a patriarchal society and our earlier, like prehistoric, much earlier, more ancient families, communities, you had um, hypergamous marriages. And so hypergamy is the situation where a woman marries her superior, somebody who's superior, older than her in age, much older. And sometimes it's because of economic reasons. So she marries somebody who's richer, right? Somebody who has a higher social status, right? And you find these relationships in the Bible. Now, this is important because I'm going to contrast um, two civilizations, right? Homer provides us insight into Greek civilization about 3,000 years ago, or more than that, because Homer lived 800, roughly 8th century BC, but the Trojan War occurred about 1200 BC, right? 400, roughly 400 years before the time of Homer, about 1200 BC. But what's interesting is there's another civilization we can compare. So Odysseus lived about 1200 BC. By the way, Odysseus, of course, this is a mythological story, but scholars of the consensus that, well, Odysseus was a character of many, a hodgepodge of mishmash of heroes put together. So there could have been a character similar, a hero similar to Odysseus, right? That was uh, that was like the template for Homer's story. So 1200 years ago there was a Trojan War. So we're assuming Odysseus lived 1200 BC, not 1200 years ago. 1200 BC. We're talking about 3200 years ago, right? Odysseus would have lived around that time, 1200 BC. Uh, Now, there was another civilization around that time that we can look at, the Hebrew or Jewish civilization, right? David's grandparents, Boaz and Ruth, another famous relationship that I want to compare. They lived around 1200 BC. Isn't that very convenient, right? So, Penelope and Odysseus lived around 1200 BC, right? Representing the Greeks. Meanwhile, uh, Boaz and Ruth, who are in the Bible, right? They're in the Old Testament. They also lived 1200 BC. That's the estimate, right? 1200 BC. Now, you can see Boaz and Ruth had a hypergamous relationship, which is typical in a patriarchy, right? So you see, Boaz was much older than Ruth. Boaz was an old man. Ruth was very young. She was a young widow. Her husband had died while she was young. Had died young, and and she was poor. Social status. She had no money. She was poor. But Boaz was rich, right? So he had a higher social status. He was an elite member of. He was a prominent member of his community, and he was also very wealthy. So she had gone to him for help, and so hoping to be able to marry him because he was related to her late husband's family. So he had rights of marriage. So, but he was much older. She knew he could take care of her. So that's a typical hypergamous relationship, right? So she married, that's Ruth, a much younger woman, married somebody of a much higher social class, who was wealthier, was much older, right? Boaz was old enough to be her father, right? So, but she went and married him because he could take care of her. So that's a hypergamous relationship, right? The woman is marrying somebody much older, has a higher social status, has higher economic power, right? So that's a hypergamous relationship. Now go 1200 BC, around the same time, go and look at Greece, right? By the way, they weren't called Greece, right? So you notice in the book by Homer, they're referred to as Achaeans, Argives, Hellenes, Danians. So those are the names that were used for the Greeks. So using the word Greek is sort of more modern right now. But those are the people we're referring to, right? So it's convenient for us to refer to them as Greeks. So you had Odysseus and Penelope. Now the Odyssey tells us that Odysseus was gone from his wife for 20 years, right? But in that 20 years, we can tell that Odysseus and Penelope were roughly the same age, because even though he'd been gone for 20 years, you had these young suitors, right, who were trying to court her, right? They were trying to marry her so they could, take over his kingdom, but they were trying to marry her so she still was a beautiful woman. And obviously at that time they would want a woman who could bear children. So she was still of childbearing, age. So she was probably in, roughly the same age as Odysseus. They were both middle age. So you see, they had age homogamy, right? Age homogamy, right? So something else that's very important is how Homer matches Odysseus's intelligence with Penelope's intelligence as well, right? I've done a video explaining book 23, how Penelope gave Odysseus the marriage test, right? The test of their bed, right? As a test to see if Odysseus was an imposter or if it really was Odysseus, right? How only Odysseus would have known that the bed was not movable, because it was carved from an olive tree whose roots were still in the ground. And the room, Odysseus had built the room, had constructed stone walls, right, around that tree, and a roof over it to create their bed chamber, to create their bedroom. And he carved that olive tree, and he made a bed out of that olive tree, and he just embossed it with gold and silver. But that bed was stationary. It couldn't be moved, and only Odysseus would know that. So she tested him. She used a trick by saying, well, the servants should go on and and move the bed, bring the bed outside. So you could see, and then Odysseus, who didn't know, he was clueless. He just suspects that, okay, hey, somebody must have cut the tree, and then he he explained that he was the one who built that, and that was how she caught on that, she discovered that, well, this must really be Odysseus, because initially she was reluctant. And you see, Odysseus is circumspect, right? Odysseus is not impulsive, because Odysseus is called the wisest man in all the earth, right? He's called the smartest man in all the earth. You see, his son says it in that he's the wisest counselor in the world. His son praises him in that book 23. His wife also says it after he reveals himself that, oh, Odysseus is the wisest of all men in the world. But she just played a trick on him. She was able to figure out if he was really Odysseus, as opposed to her fears. She feared that, well, he could be a god, right? He could have been sent by the gods to deceive her, right? So that was her fear. He could have been an imposter. And so she was very calm, and you could see when she saw Odysseus, even though she had been waiting all these years, she'd been holding out, waiting all these years, she was calm and decided that she was going to, have conduct her test to see if it was really Odysseus or it was an imposter, that, a trick, a secret that only Odysseus would know. So you could see Homer matched the both of them in wit, in intelligence, and you could see, and also in terms of troubles, right? You could see that they were best friends. In modern times, couples, husband and wives, they're more homogamous. People marry their classmates, people who have similar educational backgrounds, similar socioeconomic status, and they're often best friends. They share their business together. But back then, that was not the case. In more patriarchal societies, the woman is simply like a childbearing tool, or she's an appendage, right, to the husband. She's just a side piece. And you could see that that's not what Penelope is. After they had, embraced one another, and Penelope was certain that this was her husband, Odysseus. Odysseus, mirrors her emotions. So she cries, she weeps, flies into his arms, and she's weeping, and Odysseus weeps as well, right? He's not macho and just pampering her, he's weeping as well. So Homer's mirroring, their emotions, right? Their emotions are mirrored, and then when they're done, of course, they make love, they have their fill of love, as Homer put it. And after that, they're talking. You see husband and wife that are partners today, they share business plans together. The book 23 tells us that Odysseus told her everything, that Penelope asked him, okay, that what does he plan to do, right? What are his plans? How is he going to resolve the rest of the problems? Because Odysseus said, hey, he's created a problem. They have a problem since he's killed all the suitors, that the town's going to come after them. So Odysseus and Penelope asks, that, okay, what does he intend to do? And Odysseus shares the plans with him, shares everything, right? He doesn't hold back anything. He tells her how he met Tiresias, and Tiresias said, well, he needed to go travel inland, where he would meet a people who had never heard of the sea, and he had to take an oar with him, and until he met a traveler who would mistake the oar for a winnowing fan or a shovel, and then he would have to bury that oar right in there, and then he would have to make a sacrifice to Poseidon, and then have to make another sacrifice to all of the gods, and that's when he was guaranteed of being able to live, peacefully into old age, right? Away from the sea. He wouldn't die at sea. And so, he reveals everything to her. Something else he does, right? And that's so modern, right? Odysseus tells her all of his journeys, everything that happened on his journey, right? From the Cicones, battle with the Cicones, to the Lotus Eaters, to Lystogonians, everything that happened, um, including Cersei and her witchcraft, right? He of course became lovers with Cersei, right? And he tells her everything. He tells her how he was held captive by Calypso, and Calypso wanted him to marry her and even offered him immortality. He tells her everything. How he met a younger woman, Nausicaa, in the land of the Phaeacians, and of course, and they treated him like a god and helped him, journey. They were the ones who transported him back to Ithaca. He told her everything, just like the modern husband and wife who are best friends. They tell, they don't hold back anything. In a more patriarchal society, the husband and wife hardly talk with each other. The husband doesn't tell the wife anything, and I find this to be very interesting because we're talking about over 3,000 years ago, right? So, but what happened? So 3,000 years ago, you had um an archetype, uh, feminist, homogamous relationship, right? You could see this clearly between Penelope and Odysseus, at least amongst the Greeks, right? And the European civilizations tried to model the Greeks. So what happened? I think the Roman civilization, don't quote me on that, but I think the Romans and the Latins were more misogynist, right? So they were more misogynist uh, with their women, more sexist. And later on, when the Germanic tribes rose in Europe with the fall of the Roman Empire, and the Germanic tribes rose, and Anglo-Saxons, the Middle Ages, I think that's where we see more of the misogyny, the sexism, and the Victorian sexism that we see. You know, that the 20th century had to struggle against, right? Because if you read the Odyssey, women have a very they're central. It's like women are the ones sort of controlling the whole story, from the reason for the Iliad, for going to war. It was three goddesses: Aphrodite, Athena, and their mother Hera, who the wife of Zeus. Anyway, they were upset with Paris, right, and they decided to cause trouble for Troy. That happened, and then you go into the beginning of the Odyssey, and the patron of Odysseus is Athena, right? A goddess, a female, and she's controlling everything. She's goddess of wisdom and of war. She's controlling everything. By the way, it was her intervention uh, that ended the war. So there was a looming civil war. It had started between Odysseus and the relatives of the suitors, right? And it was Athena's appealing to Zeus, and Zeus striking with his thunderbolt, and then Athena masquerading, again disguising herself as Mentor, Odysseus's friend, and calling a covenant of peace. And that's how it basically ends. It just ends right there. Book 24, there's a covenant of peace, and the relatives settle and agree to have Odysseus back as a king, and that's it. That's how the book ends. So the role of women as equals of men in that Greek society in Homer's Odyssey is so salient, and I find it interesting because that during that same period, like I said, you could see another civilization, the Jewish civilization, where you had Boaz and Ruth. There was a hypergamous relationship, more patriarchal. Meanwhile, you had something more like a proto-feminist society amongst the Greeks, and there was homogamy between Odysseus and his wife Penelope. She matches him in intelligence, and even the troubles, right? When they're talking, on their bed, and they're discussing all the troubles Odysseus went through, they admit that she had equal troubles, playing off the suitors, delaying the suitors, managing, the conflict, keeping them from, because the suitors wanted to take over the kingdom. That's why they wanted to marry her, right? So she was able to sort of avert a coup, right? A palace coup, a takeover of Odysseus's kingdom. So she had troubles as well. And his future business plans, by the way, he also let her know, because she told him that, look, they've eaten us out of house and home, and they've squandered his wealth, the sheep, the wine, everything. And Odysseus tells her how he's going to get all of that back. He said he's going to force the town to give him back all of that, back, give him the sheep and everything he'd lost. So I think it's very interesting, and I'll do more videos discussing, analyzing the Odyssey and Christopher Nolan's reimagining of Homer's The Odyssey. My name's Olurotimi Osha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.